Hello, Internet. Evan-Benton of Dogg for Mayor here with another book report, and today I'm going to be looking at Unit 731 Testimony by Hal Gold. And I'm sorry I don't have a physical copy of this book to hold up, but I'm going to put the cover here so you can see that. So it's probably going to surprise people given my proclivities that this is the first book on Unit 731 that I've actually ever read. Of course, Unit 731 was a special unit of the Japanese military created during World War II to study biological warfare, and was infamous for its experiments on civilian subjects, namely Chinese subjects. So half of this book is a straight history book, and half of the book is testimonies from people who were directly involved in Unit 731. And so both parts of the book are useful. I would say they're very, very interesting, and I would highly recommend it if you're interested in the subject matter. And given what's going on today, everyone ought to be interested. Okay, so the history of how Unit 731 came to the public is very interesting. Apparently, in 1989, there was a new construction in Shinjuku, which is central Tokyo, and a bunch of bones were unearthed. And the interesting thing about this bunch of bones was, first of all, the people who discovered it noticed an inordinate number of skulls. So these weren't complete skeletons. The ratio of skulls to other bones was much higher than we would suggest or we would expect. Yes. So keep in mind now, Tokyo was firebombed into oblivion during World War II. So all of the construction that you'll find in modern Tokyo is post-World War II. And what they were doing at this time, 40 years after the end of the war, was they were building some skyscrapers there, and they found these bones. It was determined later that these bones were all samples from the Unit 731 laboratory in Harbin, China, and they had been sent to the Japanese mainland for conferral by other scientists and doctors there. So the official response of the Japanese government was very lackluster, and the federal or national government essentially, just denied it or brushed it under the rug, as they usually do. And there was a further result at the regional and prefectural level, where people who actually wanted to get this stuff out in the open started organizing touring museum exhibit on their own. Basically, they raised the funds and located some artifacts and put together some informational displays, and this toured the country, and this brought out a lot of eyewitnesses to Unit 731 that had been previously sworn to secrecy, and basically their guilt got the better of them, and they came forward. And this book features a lot of their testimonials then. So we know about the Nuremberg Trials. This has been talked about in the interwebs recently. There was also a set of trials called the Tokyo Trials after the war in Japan, where similar sort of war crimes were tried. Very few people know that very few people ever were indicted in these Tokyo trials. It was basically a complete dog and pony show, whereas the Nuremberg trials were only about 97% dog and pony show, shall we say. So basically no one was punished during the Tokyo trials, and a large number of Japanese scientists were imported basically into the United States, similar to Operation Paperclip, which we know about in the European theater. But so the reason that they were able to do this was because the state of the United States germ warfare knowledge and research at the time of the end of World War II was so abysmal that they were basically able to just claim to the United States scientists that germs are just different in Asia. And so you would need to have us, meaning the Japanese scientists, to to explain how they worked differently and to navigate the microbiome of Asia, as it were. So, we got a lot of Japanese scientists and doctors brought secretly to the United States at the end of World War II. But fascinating implication as well is that many of them simply went on to practice medicine in Japan after the war. So, if you went to a doctor in Japan at any time between, we'll say, 1945 and 1995, chances are that that doctor had participated in human vivisection during World War II. So just think about that. If you had any surgery in particular, chances are that doctor learned his craft by practicing on unwilling human test subjects. Now that is a frightening thing to think about for for Japanese people and for all of us, because we're all affected by this. We all in one way or another benefit directly in our medical knowledge base from these experiments. So there is an idea that the knowledge that was gained from the experiments conducted during the Holocaust and by Unit 731 and other such operations was simply lost or something like that, or has never been released to the public. And there's one study mentioned in this book where basically what happened is there were subjects in this book, in this study, that were reported as monkeys. Okay, and they found when it was published that the body temperatures that were mentioned in the study were too high to be from monkeys. So human beings, I didn't know this, but human beings have a higher body temperature than monkeys, and so they were reporting fever temperatures. And some, people who read this report were able to identify that the range of temperatures reported were simply too high for them to have come from monkeys. They must have come from humans, and therefore this was an experiment that had been conducted on humans. And so it was linked to Unit 731 that way, and it was disgraceful for, I guess, the publication. But that just it gives you a hint of something that we can look for as researchers going forward. They have hidden human experimentation by disguising it as animal experimentation. Keep an eye out for that kind of thing. That's another way is apparently some of the data that like Alfred Kinsey used for his report on human sexuality came from concentration camp victims and experiments on those as well. So other things like that, just hidden throughout the literature, are of course they can't just come right out and say it. That would be unethical, or just sort of guilty by association. But nevertheless, there are hints of this kind of thing all throughout the literature, and I wouldn't have really put that together as well without this book. So, and one implication that's very interesting too to think about is the Japanese were the world leading experts in biological warfare in the 1940s, and now they have no can't say the word, but they don't have any preventative jabby requirements for their children, and their response to the current event has not been to implicate the jabby, and they so that's just very interesting, something to contemplate. What did they learn from these experiments? Just throwing that out there. All right, the beginning now of the history then. The Japanese biological warfare program began in the Russo-Japanese War, which lasted from 1904 to 1905. So we're not talking about the 1940s really to begin with. We're actually, the Japanese primacy in the field actually extended 40 years prior to that. There was a book in 1906, which this book mentions, by an author named Louis Stevenson, and that book was called The Real Triumph of Japan. And this was a military attaché attached to the Japanese military to observe what they were doing, and he basically reported back that they were so far ahead of us in the field of biological warfare and water purification, defensive biological warfare, that it was a threat. It was a threat that would be hard for the armies of the West to meet in coming conflicts. So the commander of Unit 731 was a man named Shiro Ishii, and he was in the Japanese military in the Russo-Japanese War, and he was attached to a water purification department, and he developed a water filter which revolutionized the field. And it's sort of interesting to note that they still don't know how his water filtration device works. So it was just basically a big tube full of diatomaceous earth. Diatomaceous earth is basically sand that is composed of the silicon-based skeletons of tiny algae called diatoms, which make hard crystalline structures that they exist within, and they're apparently just very sharp. And this is how they have. You can use diatomaceous earth to against ants and other pests, and we just don't know how they work, though. They think that it's because they're sharp, but hasn't actually been proven. So that's just super interesting. A little aside, we don't know how Shiro Ishii's water filter worked. But out of the desire to prevent disease then in the field came the realization that it could potentially be used, this knowledge could be used to create disease among enemy populations. And that was basically the modern origin of germ warfare. And in 1910, Jack London, the famous author, wrote a short story which you should really check out. In fact, maybe I'll just do another book report on this because it's pretty short and interesting. And so in 1910, he describes a future scenario where China has come ahead of the world in terms of technology, and they've become a threat to the world, right? To the global powers are all so threatened by this future China and its technology and military might that they cordon it off. There's an alliance, all the countries around China cordon it off and station guards, okay, so that no one can enter or leave the country. The entire country of China, remember this is just a short story. And they send balloon bombs with some sort of biological agent floating into the country set to detonate, and they cause a plague in China, and then they just sit there on the borders shooting everyone who comes out, and this goes on for however long it takes for the entire country of China to be obliterated. And so that was a short story that was written in 1910, bearing some interesting parallels to today's geopolitical situation. And then, another factor was that there were international treaties being written up. The big one was the Geneva Protocols of 1925, which banned the use of biological weapons. So we all know that there's plenty of chemical warfare being waged in the trenches of World War I, but the biological side hadn't really been hadn't found much use for it in that conflict. But thinking proactively, the countries of the world got together and banned them anyway, although they did not ban experimentation to develop such weapons. So that just gives you some context for how threatening it was thought to be by the countries of the world leading up to World War II, and again, Japan being the unprecedented leader in this field. So and on the other side of things, just keep in mind how young germ theory was in this time period. So it was not until 1901 that Walter Reed conducted his famous experiments proving that yellow fever was spread not by direct contact between individuals, but by the mosquito itself. And he did this just with the use of mosquito netting. we have this idea that germ theory was an open and shut case, right? Louis Pasteur came along and proved that germs cause diseases, and then it just, the old theories just went quietly into the night. But that's not the case at all if we know the history. And then another just interesting point is that Walter Reed himself died of appendicitis in 1902 when he was only 51 years old. So, appendicitis is a very, very threatening condition if you don't have a surgeon on hand to treat it. But hardly anybody dies from that today. But lest you think that was, an anachronism or something for him to die of it in 1902, the condition itself was only described for the first time in 1886. So I'm saying all that just to give you an idea of how fast how fast science progresses, okay? And just give you an idea of the time period we're talking, like the massive changes that happened basically between the 1860s and 1904, 1905. And then think about, that's 40 years. Think about what could have happened in the same time period from 1904 up to 1945. So the big takeaway from all that is just to drill into your head the importance to national security interests and military interests of scientific experimentation. Okay, this was where wars were won or lost in the 19th and 20th centuries, not on the battlefield, but in the laboratory. And I recently made a book report on Dr. Joseph Farrell's work into this field with the secret experiments of the Nazis into anti-gravity and such things like that. So check that out, and check out his other works as well. But all that to just advance the speculation, which I've mentioned before and I'll mention again, and I'm not going to have time to fully flesh it out in this video, but I have the speculation that all of World War II was merely a ruse to cover up or create a justification for these types of advanced research projects. Okay, so what if the scientific elite of the day had the realization, or at least the belief, that massive numbers of human subjects were needed to research something, to find out something that they wanted to know, and how else were they going to come up with these millions of millions of subjects? Shall we say 6 million subjects? You get what I'm driving at there. So, again, when we talk about the Japanese biological warfare program of World War II, we're not talking about just World War II, right? 1937 to 1945. We're talking about the Japanese expansion into Asia, going all the way back into the early 20th century, right? 40 or 50 years before that. So, in the Japanese controlled Manchuria, the Japanese controlled Korea, and the Philippines they took right before World War II, Taiwan, and then of course they rapidly expanded out and took over Hong Kong and Singapore, basically before the United States were even involved with them or against them. So, but to further my speculation, I want to look at the scope of these projects. Okay, so first of all, the scope goes back in time that far, and then the sheer number of subjects in China alone. Japan is reported to have killed 20 million Chinese civilians throughout the course of the war there. Right, 20 million. That's a huge number. And then that leads a little speculation that I've been hearing about, and I just wanted to popped into my mind, so I'll bring it up here. There's an idea that China is not as heavily populated as it claims to be, that there aren't really a billion or so people in there. There might actually be far fewer, and that's supported by these photos we're all seeing of these massive residential towers and entire cities being built and then just left to decay, right? And they're sort of like threatening us with this idea that, well, they think that their population is going to expand so quickly soon, so they built those for that. But what if those are just what if those are just examples of corrupt sweetheart deals where they just money laundering? They just paid a guy to build. They gave some, instead of just giving someone straight cash, they gave him a contract worth millions of dollars, and then he profits off of that. Just an interesting little connection there, because we know that in Eastern Europe, the population has not recovered since the Holodomor and the terrifying famines that occurred in the 1930s throughout that part of the world. Just an interesting little connection there. And furthermore, the really tragic thing about Unit 731 and all of the deaths that it inflicted on the Chinese population was that it did not contribute meaningfully to the war effort. So that's right, they never developed a bioweapon that would be useful. Okay, there was something called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, which was, you can read about, it was a plan to put some sort of biological agent on these balloon bombs, which we all know existed. Being from Oregon, that was the one place that we have heard that the balloon bombs actually exploded and killed somebody in the United States. So the only fatality that was experienced on the United States mainland was through one of these balloon bombs landing on and detonating a family of picnickers in the southern coast of Oregon. So there was this plan that the Japanese developed to float these bombs over using the Gulf Stream current and release biological weapons, ticks and fleas and things over North America. Would that have worked? I don't know. They might have even done that. That might be something that has contributed to Lyme disease in the United States. We'll probably never know, though. But we do know that in China they plague bombed entire cities. They they dropped bombs from plagues. Sorry, they dropped bombs from planes, and infecting entire villages. And then after they had figured out whatever they wanted to do from this process, they would cordon off the village and burn the entire thing with everyone still alive in it. But the suggestion from this book is that basically none of these biological weapons that they developed would have worked. And to support that, I'm just going to read a little bit from one of the testimonies in the back of the book then. So this is from Naokata Ishibashi, and he writes, as Professor Tsuneishi pointed out in his book, when these pathogens are thrown into a river, their ability to infect is quickly lost. So I never heard that we infected the Russian army. Ishii's Japanese-style thinking was wrong by a long shot. Wherever we Japanese go, we eat raw food and drink untreated water. But the Chinese and the Russians do not drink water without boiling it. So, wow. I mentioned villages before, so a little bit of a rough transition to talking about putting stuff into the water supply, but the simple fact is that these pathogens are all destroyed by boiling, all right? So just take that wherever you go, If you're worried about drinking the water, boil it. If you're worried about eating the food, just cook it, okay? And so throughout the whole course of the war then, throughout the course of these experiments, the Japanese achieved zero person-to-person transmission, okay? And that has vast implications for what we're dealing with today, okay? None of the agents that they developed appear to have been contagious. So, think about this, for example. The Japanese started or attempted to start hundreds of plague epidemics in China. We're talking bubonic plague, black plague, rats and fleas types of situations in China. And when's the last time you heard about a plague epidemic in the context of World War II? That's right. So hundreds of attempts to start a plague pandemic, and none of them worked. Okay, so we are not living in a plague pandemic that started in 1940 or thereabouts. And go back and look at the medieval plague epidemics. Okay, they're saying that those lasted something like 300 years. Okay, just waves of plague going around Europe. Okay, killing up to a third or even half of the population in certain areas. And then another interesting point, which goes into the German development of their Wunderwaffen program as well. There was a massive racial component to these bioweapons. So the real target of the Japanese army was not the Chinese. They saw the Chinese as subhumans, and they were worried about the Russians. So the Chinese were just their test subjects. And towards the end of the war, this book details how they started when they were at peace or something like that. I'm not sure of the exact arrangement they had with Russia, but they were not at war with Russia, and Russia had a pact not to invade Japan until the very end of the war, right after the atomic bombings. And at that point, the Japanese started to amass their biological weapons against the Russians, but by that point it was too late. They realized that they didn't work and abandoned them basically, and were forced to abandon their facilities in China as well, or Manchuria. So, and another thing there that's really interesting is the comfort women situation, which is another big issue I'm not going to really get into. But they were so worried about Japanese soldiers, giving into their lust and procreating with Chinese women that they might find, that they actually imported Korean women to the field to service them, because they saw the Koreans as somewhere between Japanese and Chinese in the racial hierarchy. And that's something you see, time and again when you're looking at race in World War II, and in the context of eugenics and Darwinism, survival of the fittest types of theories like that, is that it's so much more nuanced than this just like black or white, literally black or white cartoonish view that we have today. And so, basically what we call a liberal or a leftist, a social justice warrior is completely unable to analyze the events of that time period, because they have this crazy naive view of race that the perpetrators did not share. Okay, so that's a really interesting point, and it's fascinating how that applies to scientific theories, of course, and then also just to medicine and to the practice of medicine and to experimental medicine in particular. Talk about the Tuskegee experiment, and on and on and on. Experiments in Haiti. We'd be here all day talking about stuff like that. So, but that's about it for what I want to say about this book. As I usually do, I'm not giving a point by point, play by play summary of the book. I'm really just talking about how it relates to my own research, and I've done a ton of research reading about germ warfare, and this is one of those books. So I don't want to give it all away, because I want you to go and read it if it sounds interesting. But this little talk is going to help. If you do go and read the book, or if you don't, it's going to help it's going to help you see how it fits into the bigger picture of what we're talking about with black budget projects, secret technology, you know, and the covert control of the world and the covert control of science that has led us to today, where, you know, we're seeing, you know, almost all the scientists in the world, almost all the doctors that you will come in contact with your life, through your life, be it through having a baby delivered or having your tonsils taken out, you know, or the cancer that claims so many people's lives. They're all operating under this false paradigm, you know, that was put in place, you know, over 150 years ago, and really solidified during World War II, and then moving forward through the Cold War and these black budget projects, which continued working for these powers that should not be. So that's about it. If you have any questions, please leave a comment down below or shoot me an email. If you like this type of stuff, please support my work on the channel and share the video. Subscribe to us on all the different streaming platforms. And thanks for watching. This has been Evan Benton of Dogg from Air. Thank you and good night.